And today I'm really pleased to have Charles Bahne with us, who's going to talk about the Boston Tea Party. And we just felt he was the perfect person to do this. As many of you may know, he's a really noted local historian and tour guide, and has also written the best book out there on the Freedom Trail, which we and most every other site on the Freedom Trail sells in great quantities. So I hope you enjoy the lecture today, and please help me welcome Charles Bahne.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm a little taller than she is. Can you hear me? It's been called, well, we're here to celebrate. Next Tuesday will be the 230th anniversary of an event which the prelude occurred here. The event has been called the Catalyst for Revolution, the night the revolution began, the single most important event leading up to American independence. Governor Thomas Hutchinson called it the boldest stroke which had yet been struck in America. Open general revolt must be the consequence, is what Hutchinson said. And John Adams at the same time called it the most magnificent movement of all, an epocha in history. I'd like to look at a little bit of the background of why it happened, what got the start here in Boston, and maybe look at some of the misconceptions and myths and legends, why it happened and why it fascinates us so much. And I'd like to start, actually, with the room that we're in. And yes, we know that the meeting took place here shortly before the Boston Tea Party. But the focus is, what is this room? You look and your most common sense is you're going to say it's a church. But it's actually a congregational meeting house, and this is significant. And I think this is a real important reason why the revolution began in Boston. And it's appropriate that this building played such an important role. The Puritan church became the Congregational church. This was the second building of the third parish to be founded in Boston. The parish was gathered in 1669. This building erected 60 years later in 1729. And by congregational, we mean that the congregation was all important. There was no hierarchy. There was no bishop who told the people what they could say in church. We go back to the era of John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who lived next door adjacent to the property now called Spring Lane. Winthrop and the Puritans left England. This is 143 years before the destruction of the tea. They came to America so they could worship as they wanted to, without the interference of the Church of England and the bishops and hierarchy of that church telling them every Sunday what they could or could not say on Sunday morning. They, as much as anything, wished to avoid the corruption that they saw in the Church of England of bribes and favored officials getting favored positions. By congregational, we mean that each congress would have a pact between themselves, the individual parishioners, and God, and nobody else. There was no central office, nobody higher up other than God to tell them what they could do or could not do, and the congregation hired its own minister. And they didn't even call it a church. They called it a meeting house, as in Old South Meeting House. The meeting houses in the early days, and this is a reproduction done 200 years later of the first meeting house in Boston, which stood across the street from the old State House, only stood for about 6 years in 1632, 1638. The meeting houses served a dual function. They would go to Sunday meeting, their church services on Sunday. And then That was every Sunday. Not so often, once or twice or 3 times a year, they would go to town meeting in the very same building. And originally it was the members of the church who could vote in the town meeting. It was this distinction, in fact, the final break between Massachusetts being a theocratic democracy did not occur until about 1820. Boston, as we'll see, was unique in having a town hall. So they had as I say, the same sense of going to meeting, whether it was for religious or secular purposes, in the same building. And this is the importance of the Old South Meeting House. Now, the Puritans came from rural England. I always comment that people think this was the age of Shakespeare, 1630. Shakespeare had just passed away. Well, that's what they were trying to get away from. They thought theater was sinful. They were religious fundamentalists. They wanted to reform the Church of England to take it back to the early days of Christianity. But they were also very well educated. They valued education themselves, which is why we see the creation of the first public school in America and the first college in English America, both within 6 years of the founding of their colony. One also must realize that England in the 1600s was in tremendous political turmoil. The Puritans came here. They got their charter from Charles I. They originally intended to have a relatively small group. We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of the world shall be upon us as a model Christian community. But even before they departed, once they got their charter, Charles I and his officials began persecution of the Puritans in England, so tens of thousands of them arrived, many more than they had planned in the first decade. And due to the political turmoil in England, including the English Civil War, the British government really couldn't pay much attention to what was going on in the colonies, especially Massachusetts. The kings didn't exactly like what was going on in Massachusetts in the 1600s, but they were too busy with the threats that they had in their own turf. And one of the things that happened as a result of that, well, two. One was the continued focus on democracy, their town meetings, and the elected legislature. And secondly, the fact that the people here in America had to create their own shipping channels, and there was not much interference. They couldn't always get what they wanted to due to the political difficulties in England. They couldn't get it from the mother country, so they would set up trade with other countries, such as Holland especially. And the British government, while it officially frowned on this, didn't have the staff to try to stop it. So we fast forward 130 years, 5 generations. We're now talking about the great-great-great-grandchildren of the original settlers. This is a view of Boston in 1727. You may see this view in many locations, and you may see many dates on it, but 1727 is the correct date. And by the way, if you look, you will look in vain for this building, because that's the predecessor. This view was 2 years before this building was erected. You can see the old State House with its older cupola before it was replaced after a fire, and the Old North Church or Christ Church with a conjectural steeple, because the steeple hadn't yet been built when the artist did this painting. Those are the only 2 buildings you'll recognize. Boston in the 1760s had a population of about 18,000 people. And by that time, there were 18 different religious congregations, not all of which were Puritan. It was a major port. It at one point in the 1720s had been the major port in British America, but it had been surpassed by New York, Philadelphia. It still retained much of the political independence of its forebears. The people valued education, they valued their political self-determination, and they still had a very strong abhorrence of the corruption that they saw in the English governmental and religious systems. Corruption where the sense was that it was who your parents were or your grandparents that would get you a government position, a well-paying government position. You might actually do very little for that position. And because of the century and a third of salutary neglect by the British government, smuggling was rife. One thing that made Boston different from the other towns in Massachusetts was that we had a town hall built in 1742. We get back to the Congregational meeting house. Most towns, and I think probably Boston was the only town, I may be wrong, that had a separate town hall. Go to Cambridge, to Lexington, to Charlestown, the church still served as the town meeting hall. Some of those towns had more than one church, but the first church, the centrally located church, still served as the town meeting hall, the Puritan church. And again, that remained the case in most towns until about 1820. Now, this is North America. This is a map published in France in the 1750s. And you can see the English territory is the green territory going from Georgia up the Atlantic coast to part of Maine, part of Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. And the yellow and pink are French and Spanish, and you can see that France has all of Canada, all of the St. Lawrence Valley, the Great Lakes, and with Spain they control all of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and Florida. And basically the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, was a culmination of 100 years of on and off war between the two great superpowers, England and France. It involved, you can see how far west the British influence extended, and there were constant skirmishes between the Native Americans who were aided by the French. The Native Americans got as far as, in one case, as the western suburbs of Philadelphia in one of their skirmishes. And ultimately, England won the war, but as we know today from looking at the newspapers, wars are expensive. Governments go into debt. And in this case, England won the war and won all this territory, everything except for Florida and west of the Mississippi. They won all that from France, everything east of the Mississippi and north of Florida, all of Canada. And England felt that they needed to station a standing army, not only to pay off the costs of the war, but afterwards they would need to keep soldiers in forts in all this territory to keep the Indians calm. So there was a need for revenue. And England tried at various occasions to collect revenue from its British colonies, with no success. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townsend Act. If you look at the preamble of the Stamp Act, you can actually see towards further defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the British colonies and plantations in America. That's in the preamble of the law. The Townsend Act is, as I say, they were all unsuccessful. They all led to huge protests in the colonies, and not a single penny of any of these taxes. Well, some of the Townsend Act taxes were collected, it's true. The Townsend Act taxes are, though, quite significant. There were a series of taxes which covered glass, paper, lead, painter's colors, and tea. And the colonists throughout the British colonies decided that their protest would be to boycott British goods. Not just to boycott the goods that were taxed, but to boycott all British goods. Remember, smuggling, a lot of smuggling was going on. But under the British colonial system, we weren't allowed to have factories, to have manufacturing in the colonies. All manufactured goods, which largely were clothing, had to come from England. The raw cotton might grow in South Carolina, but they'd take it to England and make it into cotton cloth and send it back to America. And 25% of the market of British factories was in the North American colonies. And the idea was, hey, if we don't buy that, we don't have a voice in Parliament, but those factory owners do, and they'll complain if their sales go down. And the sales did go down. Interestingly enough, while there was a strong anti-importation, non-importation movement in Boston, it was most successful in New York and Philadelphia, which even more than Boston had established trading channels with other countries, particularly Holland, New York being a former Dutch colony, and also, as we'll see, due to the opposition in Boston of certain merchants in the town. But now we focus on tea. And I thought wait a second. Did the slide disappear too? Well, I guess I thought I had it in there. We focus on tea, and we come to tea is one of the goods that was under the non-importation boycott. Actually, the boycotts were so successful that in 1770 the Parliament repealed the Townsend Acts, except they kept the tax on tea due to Lord North's insistence that they prove that they had the right to tax the colonies. So the regular boycotts of manufactured goods and cloth ended, but still a lot of people weren't buying tea because of the tax on it. And actually, the situation at the beginning of 1773 with tea was rather interesting. Tea was an ideal product to be smuggled. Once you took it out of the chest, there's no way of telling where it came from. You could pack it in a chest that indicated that it had come legally. And Holland was a major source of tea. By the 1760s, the British colonists throughout North America were consuming well over 1 million pounds weight of tea every year. That's about 150 to 200 cups per person per year, or more, because much of that tea was smuggled. Depending on your sources, at least 3/4 and perhaps possibly as much as 90% of the tea was smuggled. And because we have no records of how much tea was smuggled, that could have been much more than the million pounds. Could have been almost 2 million pounds of tea consumed every year in America. The British law said that we could trade only with England, especially with tea, and the East India Company, the biggest corporation in England, had a monopoly on not only tea, but all imports, all British imports from India, China, and basically all of Asia and the Indian Ocean. And because not only of the Townsend Act duties, but other high duties on the price of tea, which had been instituted, and these, the colonists said that we didn't really have an objection to duties that applied throughout the British Empire that were intended to regulate trade. That's what they said. In fact, they didn't pay them. They did so much smuggling. And whether it was tea or not, many of the tax collectors here found that they were bribed. They got collected more in bribes for their own pockets than they did in taxes to send back to England. But as I said, tea was very great for smuggling because you could hide it. You could put it in a carton that somebody else had used for tax tea. Much of the tea was smuggled via the small Dutch island in the Caribbean known as St. Eustatius or Statia. And Benjamin Laborie has documented that even in 1754, almost 20 years before the Boston Tea Party, the voyage of the Lydia, a ship owned by Thomas Hancock, John Hancock's uncle, which picked up 15 chests of tea at Statia and sold them here in Boston for a 200-pound sterling profit. Even before the Townsend Act taxes, the duties on legal British tea were so great that it was much cheaper to smuggle the tea, and that's why the market was so great. The Townsend Act taxes made matters that much worse. And we look in the figures and we see that at New York, for example, the East India Company's business after the Townsend Act, business fell 99.96%, from bringing in 350,000 pounds of legal tea before the Townsend Act to 147 pounds in a single year. Philadelphia landed just 65 pounds of East India Company tea in 1770. Ironically, Boston was a major center for the sale of legal tea due to the fact that certain merchants in town refused to honor the boycotts. Still, after the Townsend Acts, as I said, the general taxes were repealed, but the tea tax remained. The East India Company, unable to sell its tea and having other problems such as corruption, mismanagement, exceedingly high dividend rate, any of this sound familiar, like U.S. corporations today, and a general financial panic going on in London led to problems. The East India Company continued to bring in tea from Asia, even though it couldn't sell any of it. And it had at one point 18 million pounds of tea stored in warehouses in London, much of it starting to rot due to poor storage conditions, owed the British government over 1 million pounds and petitioned the government for relief. Some things never change. Just think of any big American corporation that's had difficulties in the last couple of decades, and they get a bailout from government, and that's exactly what happened with the Tea Act passed in May of 1773. It had two major provisions. It reduced the tax on tea sold in America, but it kept the tax that the colonists hated, the Townsend Act tax. Their second provision was that it changed the method of selling tea in America. Previously, the East India Company would have a big auction a few times a year over in London, and American merchants would attend or send their agents there and bid on the cost on the tea and ship it over themselves to America and resell it here. Now the idea was that the East India Company would send the tea over itself to its own agents in America called consignees, who would sell it here to the general public and to store owners. It eliminated one layer of middleman, reduced the overall sales price even further, and combined with the reduction in taxes, it increased the level of profit for the company, but also meant that the East India Company could undercut the price of the smuggled tea. The price of tea in general would be less to the consumer, and so the people in England thought this was a great idea. There was just very little debate in Parliament about whether to keep the Townsend Act tax or not, but Lord North insisted on keeping it. Didn't explain his reasons, just insisted on keeping it. So the reaction in America to the whole tea plan was that the merchants who smuggled tea were opposed because they were going to lose business. Their price was going to be undercut. Many of the merchants who in the past had legally sold tea were also opposed because now they were kept out of the, shut out of the trade. Merchants who sold other goods were in many cases opposed to the new method of selling tea because they were fearful that if this worked with tea, it would be done with whatever they sold. While all of these issues, there was a sense of opposition to the tea plan, the public debate generally turned to taxes. They saw the tea tax as a Trojan horse that if people would pay for this taxed tea, then the British government could say, see, you paid it there, that's a precedent, we can tax other things and we can raise the taxes higher and higher. So as news of the Tea Act spread throughout the colonies, the general consensus: don't allow any of that taxed tea to be landed at any port. In Boston, to make matters worse, the consignees who were chosen to sell the tea were people detested by a large percentage of the populace. They included two sons of the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson Jr. and his brother Elisha. They included merchant Richard Clark and his two sons, Isaac and Jonathan, and these had been the most intransigent merchants in all of America in not honoring the non-importation boycotts of the Townsend Acts. And the fact that you've got relatives of the governor, and the Clarks were relatives of the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, would bring back the old sense of corruption, leading to even greater popular resentment and opposition. The Clarks and the Hutchinsons were not the only consignees, but they were the chief ones. One of the other ones included Benjamin Faneuil Jr., whose uncle, Peter Faneuil, had built Faneuil Hall 31 years earlier. Now, under the tea plan, there were 4 shipments of tea to be sent to America. The largest 2 shipments were to go to New York and Philadelphia. They were of equal size. Another shipment to Boston, a little less than half of the shipments going to New York and Philadelphia, and a still smaller shipment going to Charleston, South Carolina, for a total of almost 300 tons of tea. Boston itself had been relatively quiet for the 3.5 years since the Boston Massacre, but it erupted again. An angry crowd met outside the warehouse of the Clark family and called for the resignation, just as consignees in other towns were asked to resign. First meetings held at Faneuil Hall, even before the first ship arrived. A universal demand for the consignees to resign and for the tea to be sent back to England. By an accent of geography, the first ship arrived Boston. The Dartmouth arrived on November 28th, followed 4 days later by the Eleanor, and 6 days after that by the Beaver. And on the day after the first ship arrived, we have the first meeting to take place here at the Old South Meeting House. Faneuil Hall had gotten too small. Too many people wanted to attend the meetings. Now, there's a little bit of complication. The deadline was 20 days after arrival. The ship had to be unloaded within those 20 days, or on the 20th day, the government would seize the ship, unload the cargo, and deliver it to the consignees so it would be sold throughout the colonies. Over those 20 days, the protests and debates culminated with the famous meeting, which we see a modern picture of shown here, in the Old South Meeting House on the morning and afternoon of December 16th, attended by some 5,000 people. Fire laws were a little different back then. Also, the second balcony was bigger. Was as big as the first balcony that you see. Samuel Savage was the moderator. Many people think it was Samuel Adams. It was not. But it ended when Samuel Adams rose from the floor of the meeting. I don't know how they found him with all those 5,000 people there, and uttered the famous words, "Gentlemen, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country," followed by the destruction of the tea on board the 3 ships. Now, with apologies to my hosts, I must say it is a common misconception to say that the Tea Party began here, because from that we get this sense that the crowd voted to destroy the tea and went out to the wharves, that people were shouting, as we see at one location, "Dump the tea into the sea," here at the meeting. No. Of the 5,000 people here, probably 99% had no idea what was going to happen next. And the people who had an idea what was going to happen next, most of them were elsewhere, disguising themselves. A few people, Samuel Adams' line was obviously a cue. He knew what was going to happen next. Those who yelled "to the wharves" knew the secret. But the actual planning for the Tea Party and the destruction of the tea had occurred in other secret locations, such as the Green Dragon Tavern. If you're wondering where the Green Dragon originally stood, there's a big parking garage north of the Union Oyster House. Between that and Haymarket Station, actually has the Orange Line entrance in it. That's where the Union Oyster, the Green Dragon, stood, in the middle of that parking garage. Eads and Gill's print shop, which is stood over where the Shelter for Homeless Veterans is now on Court Street. Fort Hill, down by International Place. Hollis Street, next to the Wang Center. Most of the 120 or so participants weren't here at the Old South, but rather they were at these other locations, and probably others in their own houses, putting the soot on their face. No, they did not dress up like Plains Indians. But they all came at the same time from all these different locations, clearly that they were very well organized. Here's the Old South Meeting House. And they would have gone out all three doors of this building. A few views of the destruction of the tea, and we might mention some statistics. 3 ships, as we know. Many of the history books say 342 chests, including my own, and I realized in doing the research for this talk that while a lot of history books say that, it's actually 340 chests for some unknown reason. Of those, 240 were full chests, and 100 were what were called quarter chests. The full chests weighed about 350 pounds each. The quarter chests about 80 pounds each. One of the questions lost to posterity, and lost in the history books because very few of the books answer this question, and some do it only in an appendix, is exactly how much tea was destroyed. And for that answer, you need to go to the Public Record Office, His Majesty's Archives in England, and you can find this document, the last 2 pages of a petition from the East India Company for the damages for the lost tea. And over here, it itemizes the amount of tea. It doesn't total up the weights. It lists all the weights. You've got to do the addition yourself. And you'll find that it's 92,616 pounds of tea. 46 tons. And I see a number of my friends here who work on tour buses, and one of those buses weighs 15 tons. So think of the weight of 3 of those big tour buses we see going up School Street. 18.5 million cups of tea could be brewed. That's enough tea for each man, woman, child, and infant in Boston to have 3 cups a day for over 11 months, almost a full year. Based on the average consumption in the town of Boston, it would be enough to last the residents of Boston almost 7 years. But obviously the tea was going to be distributed throughout New England. This tea was coming here to go throughout New England. The monetary valuation is another issue. This does total up, in all, 9,659 pounds sterling, 6 shillings and 4 pence. Using the exchange rate between pounds and dollars that was implemented after American independence, we come to a dollar value in 1780 of $32,197.72. Another way of putting that, we know how much Paul Revere paid for his house, 213 pounds, 6 shillings, 8 pence. That was 3 years before the destruction of the tea. And this is 45 times, over 45 times the price that Paul Revere paid for his 7-room house. Today, if you were to go to the grocery store and say, I'd like to buy 18.5 million tea bags, they'd tell you it would be about $1 million. That's the market value of it, or more. The windrows of tea were at the high tide line were 3 to 4 feet high. Some of the tea washed up in Charlestown and Dorchester on the shore. And a comment was made that the tea may have so contaminated the water in the harbor that the fish may have contracted a disorder not unlike the nervous complaints of the human body. Some people found the tea in their boots when they got home, or their shoes. Some of them threw it in the fireplace, but several people put it in vials, and I actually forgot to check. Michelle, you've got one in one of the cases here. The old State House, the Old North Church formerly had one. Several of the libraries, Massachusetts Historical Society, had these collections of tea, real tea from the Boston Tea Party. There are about 120 participants identified through family legend, although some eyewitness accounts say that only about 60 people participated. This was such a secret event that nobody wanted to admit it until a generation later. And some of the people who boasted about it may have simply watched it as opposed to really participated. There were at least 1,000 observers on the shore. Of the participants we've identified, they are ages 14 to 57, mostly under 40, all male. Many of them from outside of Boston. Large numbers of people from Roxbury, Charlestown, Cambridge, Watertown, Worcester, and even Maine. Some of them clearly planned to participate in advance. Others joined on the spur of the moment. And as I said, they did not dress as Plains Indians, mostly because nobody had seen a Plains Indian at that point. Lewis and Clark came 30 years later. So, before I end, I'll briefly comment about what happened to the tea in the other cities. There's actually a fourth ship sent to Boston, the William, which was wrecked off of Cape Cod. That had a smaller cargo than any of the three ships that arrived in Boston. That tea was salvaged. 2 chests were given by the owner to a man on Cape Cod who sold some on credit, but he never paid the man that he bought it the tea from, so the tax was never paid. The other 56 chests from the William ended up coming to Castle Island, where the consignees and British royal officials were holed up, and I guess they drank it. If not, they blew it up when they left Castle Island in 1776. New York and Philadelphia, in both cases, they had the largest shipments, twice the size of the Boston shipment. In both cases, the consignees, the people who were supposed to receive the tea, resigned in early December, before the tea was destroyed in Boston. And when the ships arrived, after they had arrived in Boston, nobody was willing to accept the tea. They were aware of what had already happened in Boston, so the ships didn't even come into the port. They stayed miles offshore. The word was passed, and the ships returned to England. In Charleston, the consignees also refused to accept the shipment, but the ship entered the harbor. It was unloaded. The tea was put in a warehouse, and depending on the source, you will either hear that the rotted away because of poor storage, or that it was sold in 1775 by the Patriots to finance the war effort. That was all the East India Company tea there was, and technically there was no need to protest the other shipments, but even smuggled tea that had no taxes paid on it, people destroyed it in places such as Shrewsbury, Weston, Massachusetts, Lyme, Connecticut. And you are probably familiar with this product sold in many gift shops, Boston Harbor Tea, packed by Davison Newman Company. It turns out that 3 months after the famous Tea Party, the brig Fortune arrived in Boston with a varied cargo that included 28.5 chests of tea from this company, which the people of Boston did the same thing they had done 3 months earlier, boarded the ship and destroyed it, and this was in March. The British response, of course, to return the governor to Governor Hutchinson was recalled back to London, replaced with a military governor, General Gage. Various laws passed, an act for the better regulating of the government of the province of the Massachusetts Bay in New England, the Coercive Acts. The soldiers who came over with General Gage were the ones who got involved at Lexington and Concord, in part over disputes over acts like this. I will leave you with one final thought. The origin of the term Boston Tea Party. Alfred Young, who wrote a book a few years ago about George Hughes, one of the participants in the Tea Party, has documented the fact that the name Boston Tea Party wasn't used until about 60 years later. They simply called it the destruction of the tea. About 1834 is the first recorded instance of that use. What Al Young didn't note was where that name came from, and I want to show you the original Boston Tea Party. This is a painting. The actual painting is at the Museum of Fine Arts, and it's about the same size as it's projected on the screen, if not bigger, by Henry Sargent. Painted in 1821, oil on canvas, and Henry Sargent lived in the Tontine Crescent, the houses designed by Bulfinch over on what's now Franklin Street, near the corner of Arch Street. And Sargent painted this. This is the original Boston Tea Party. Actually, it was just called that Tea Party. And this was the 1820s equivalent of a blockbuster exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts. They rented a hall up at the end of Washington Street across from the old State House and charged a quarter for people to see this painting. And people lined up practically around the block to get in. And after its run in Boston, it went to other cities. And the idea was that this was how the middle and lower class could see how proper Bostonian, the elite, lived. This was the epitome of elegance. And this painting, the Tea Party, was followed by Sargent's second painting, the Dinner Party. Both paintings depict rooms in his house in the Tontine Crescent and furniture. The probate records show that he owned this furniture. And so here we have the original Tea Party. And I guess all I can say at this point is, gentlemen, this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Thank you. I guess is there time for a few questions? Those who want to stay, I know some people may have to run off, but you really don't want to run off in this lovely weather. Okay. One, yes. Yeah, I was running a little short. There was certainly an element of disguise, soot on their face so that they could not be seen. There probably were some feathers, a single or feather stuck in a hair or something like that. People probably may well have put blankets over them so that nobody would recognize their normal clothing. He always wears that coat or something like that. Yes, there was an element of trying to look like Indians, but not the images that we have today were not the Indians that were familiar to the people here. They were Mohawks. Mohawks would be from western Massachusetts and upstate New York. And he was actually referred to, there was one of the British officials saw one of the leading patriots, and the leading patriots actually stayed, the well-known ones, stayed clear of it, stayed on the other side of town. Samuel Adams lived not far from the Tea Party site, but he stayed on the other side of town, so nobody could see him. And but somebody approached, I forget if it was him or somebody else, the next day and said, "Pleasant night last night for your Indian caper." So obviously there was the sense of Indians. Yeah. Well, it's sort of like a sales tax today. You know, you go to the I don't want to say the grocery store. You go to a store and you pay sales tax, and you pay the tax to them. They put it in the cash register, and periodically they send the check off to the state. Well, that was part of the whole debate of this thing, but they thought that, I think the people thought that maybe by keeping it, you see, it won't be so obvious. That was the whole point, that gets people to pay the tea because it won't be on your itemized bill. It's not even really like the sales tax where they add it in at the end. It's like a gasoline pump. You know, the price on the pump says includes all taxes. I think they thought it would calm things down. I think that they would, yeah. Oh, thanks very much. It was a